did use this idea that it was maybe a Russian novel. We would never dare to say out loud War and Peace, but that you knew that you had lots of so-called ordinary people and sort of primary and secondary and tertiary characters, kind of top-down meeting a bottom-up, and how you do the respiration of it became the work of a decade of trying to do that, to write to it. As you know, our friend Jeffrey Ward is so extraordinary at doing that. But the fact that our script isn't sort of written once and then, is delivered chiseled in stone, but is something that evolves over time, and it has some certain fluidity in the editing, and the same with research. And, we found at the end, Gerald, that the last few months of editing, we were just pulling out adjectives and pulling out adverbs that were unnecessary. They could perhaps give an impression to people depending on their particular, perhaps political viewpoint, that we were for or against something, and we didn't need to do that here. We could be equal opportunity critics and let the story and the narrative speak for itself. We were at the War College yesterday in Leavenworth, Kansas, and showed almost as many officers very similar clip reel to this, and their teacher, who was retiring after 50 years of considering Vietnam and whatever lessons he could learn, just said, I need you all to just see all 18 hours, and then you need to decide, because these people haven't gotten in the way of you deciding what you think. And that's something that that was a treasure of a comment, because it's something we wanted to have happen.
I have this pen. I went to have a clipboard, so I would do my best imitation of Bill Buckley.
Well, he did spend 40 years in public broadcasting, and yes. I'm up to 40 years now.
One of the things that struck me about this is that, unlike your other two war epics, Civil War and The War, this was a war you lived through. This was a war you had memories about. So how did that factor into the making of all this? Because the war meant something to you that was different than the other films.
Very much so. I played with blue and gray soldiers with my brother when we were growing up, and my dad was a veteran of the Second World War, and I spent a lot of time in my backyard killing Germans. And but this was different. This was something I experienced, and when we made the decision to do it, there was something in the back of my mind. It was similar to what I felt with baseball, the only other subject in which I went, finally something I know about, because I make a big deal of saying we don't pick things that we know about, that, that would be telling you what you should know rather than sharing with you a process of discovery. And so I clearly I grew up in those years in Ann Arbor, Michigan. My dad was on the faculty in the anthropology department. The anthropology department was one of the principal sponsors of one of the first teach-ins in March of '65 at the university. I remember all of that very, very keenly. And I saw, obviously, all the countercultural aspects, the artistic, the musical, things that went along with opposition to the war, but also had within me this latent kind of sort of utter kind of gut Americanism that I would look at. I grew up, the Cuban Missile Crisis and Kennedy assassination made me an adult overnight, and so it was very much, I read the paper every day. I watched the nightly news with my dad every day, and I remember always being so happy that there was more of them being killed than us. And I couldn't reconcile that deep feeling with also what my head or what the people around me were saying in opposition to the war. So I presumed that I would carry into this a lot of baggage, and this has been a 10-and-a-half-year effort, and I don't know where my baggage is. It's gone. I mean, first of all, as I said in the introduction, I was so humiliated at the beginning at what I didn't know that you just had to start all over. It was just to hit a reset button, and at that point, somewhere along the line, the baggage disappeared, the preconceptions disappeared. I mean, just learning that Ho Chi Minh by 1959 is marginalized is so destabilizing of whatever minuscule conventional wisdom that you have, that you say, well, I don't even know who was the leader of the enemy in a real day-to-day management sense, then I've got I'm behind. I need to catch up. And so it was really all of us, Sarah Botstein, our senior producer, and Lynn Novick, the co-director, myself, Jeff, the entire team of editors. We really had to spend this time sort of forgetting everything. And so I really don't recognize the person that went into this and the person that I am now. I have memories of who I was back then, but I know that somewhere along the way, I think thankfully, we all checked that at the door. It's interesting, Jeff is in his 70s. He contracted polio as a child, so there wasn't any question of his being involved. I'm in my 60s, Lynn is in her 50s, Sarah Botstein, our senior, is in the 40s, and all of us came from it, from different things. For Lynn, it was sort of a dark, sort of unformed, unarticulated bad thing that was happening in her childhood. And Bots is something that she read about, you know.
Yeah. The film, for anyone, any baby boomer, and we're nearly the same age, looking at the film, it just brought back so much. I mean, it was just incredible. It was, at times, not even talking about the horrific battle scenes, it was just times it was just hard to watch, period, even when there weren't horrific battle scenes.
You know, I think that we sort of, I felt this about the Civil War, and I feel this has most similarity to the Civil War, insofar as the World War II had a particular thing that we did. We said we'd look at that war through the lives of 4 American towns and try to cover the greatest cataclysm in human history that way. But Civil War and Vietnam were the same insofar as we were willing to look at both sides and listen to them. And it reminded me of the similarities, indeed, in all wars, and particularly there, because so much of the Vietnamese experience is a civil war, if not a war for independence or a Marxist revolution. I mean, it's all these things and none of those things. And so I felt it was important, as in the Civil War, when I would try to ask questions about the Civil War, and I was interested in battles. Everybody was interested in cause and effect. They wanted to put it in a kind of political science category, and that was it. This is what happened, this is why it happened, this is what happened afterwards. And I really wanted to know what the battles were, who the generals were. And they were like, oh, you're interested in that? Go see old Professor so-and-so, you know, emeritus, as if it didn't matter what happened on July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, 1863 in South Central Pennsylvania. And you know what? It does. Yes. So here I felt that even more, because of our amnesia about it, the fact that it's so much unfinished business and that so many of us have ignored it, that to learn about Ap Bak and Bin Jah and Yadrang and all these 20 or 30 battles that you'll get to know about the way you know Shiloh was important. I also think for us, old men, that it's, the music is hugely important for us. And we had music in 3 different categories in a way we've never had before. One is this original material that Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross of 9 Inch Nails produced for us, which is just, you know, all of the anxiety and the angst and the pain, you know, that was cheery. You need a drink. And yet they are able to resolve it melodically and even emotionally in positive ways. We also took a lot of Vietnamese folk songs and lullabies that anybody would remember, north to south, and had Yo-Yo Ma and the Silk Road Ensemble kind of reinterpret it and bend it to their will. But we are also able to get 150 tunes, or 120 tunes from the period. Some extraordinary jazz and country music and folk music, but mostly rock and roll. And it's a particularly fertile period. And I know this anecdotally, because not only was it the music of the soundtrack of my life, but it was also of my daughter's lives and now my grandchildren's lives. So I know the music is good, it's lasting, they know this stuff. And we did an interesting thing, this is probably beside the point in terms of, you know, documentary filmmaking. Traditionally, the Beatles have never licensed anything, period. And we went to them first and we said, we need to tell the story and you're part of it and your music is interrelated and it's a chicken and egg, we can't do this. And traditionally we could have afforded 10 tunes, not 120 tunes, but we needed to get the best music of the period. And so the Beatles agreed, and we have 5 or 6 Beatles songs in, which is just revolutionary, and including Revolution. And we have Bob Dylan and Led Zeppelin and the Rolling Stones and Marvin Gaye and Otis Redding and Fairport Convention and Miles Davis and, you know, Joan Baez and I mean the Animals, you name it. It is the best soundtrack, given the length of the film, the best soundtrack there is. And all of them, every artist, every estate, every label, every publisher said yes. They understood that we weren't going to use them the way those British comedies do, where you play a hip song from the time, I feel good, and then all it's doing is amplifying emotions that actually aren't there in the film and creating new ones because of the quality of the music. They knew we would bake this in authentically and organically. And we promised ourselves first and then them that we would never play a piece of music that wasn't playing at the time that it was happening. That is, you needed to be a soldier listening to Armed Forces Radio or Radio Saigon, or somebody heading to a demonstration, or just somebody else in their car radio listening to this music. And so for me and for you, I imagine the couple of notes, and you know exactly where you were and what you felt and who you were and the kind of naivete you had or the stupidness you had or the fact that you knew everything at that time. And the music was this important glue for me to understand it.
Yeah, it was really striking. I think it might have been episode 5 or 6 where you opened with Jimi Hendrix, Are You Experienced?
Yes.
And it just made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I mean,
Yeah.
that sequence was just incredible.
We won't give away the last music, the end credit music, because people are going to need, after this emotional car wash, to get out, and we think we picked the best piece of music. But throughout that, I have an editor who's in his 40s, and we were doing in the 10th episode the sort of onslaught when the peace agreement's been signed, the Americans are no longer going to come to the rescue, even with air power. And so the North is just moving down. And he put in Kashmir, which was appropriate for the time, by Led Zeppelin. And does anyone know this tune? Da-da-dum, da-da-dum, da. And it's just, I turned to him, I said, Craig, I've been working with this guy for 20 years. And he came to me as a kid, you know, just out of high school or college. And I said, Craig, how did you know to do this? This is perfect, you know? And it was one of those great moments, you know, and among many, many moments when you feel that the music is appropriate. And sometimes it's foreground, you know, you can be hearing Pete Seeger hearing Waist Deep in the Big Muddy or some such thing, or it's background and you go, wait a second, that's Steppenwolf. And what we did to make it even more organic is we asked the people that we interviewed what they were listening to, what they liked. And that was the Vietnamese too, so you'll hear this extraordinary lullaby. And at one point in the 10th episode, there's a general, a guy who we've met early on in the film. I think the 4th episode is where he first comes in, an officer, junior officer in the North Vietnamese army named Lo Coc Tam, and he's going through, and we've got his counterparts, his doppelgangers on our side. And we watch him sort of progress. He's a general now and very revered. But he breaks down and cries on film when he thinks of this lullaby and this song, because the thing that we forget is that Vietnam is extraordinarily unsettled for us now, still. But it's also unsettled for them. We have wonderful relations and great reconciliation, moments of intimate reconciliation take place when soldiers go back and meet their former enemies, and it's just wonderful. And it's shown in the film, and you wish, it'll never happen because of human nature, you sort of wish, couldn't we just jump to the reconciliation part? Do we have to do all that other cruddy stuff? But, you know, they're wrestling with the idea that could they have done it a different way? Did they have to lose that many millions of people? Because, as Les One, their leader, said, we will not count the cost. Was there a way with negotiation? Could there have been compromises? Could there have been a way in which not every family would have an amputated limb that still twitches and aches because it's not there? And Lo Coc Tam sort of represents this profound grief still to this moment that he has all these parents out there for whom he cannot tell them where their son is, and it grieves him. And you think about us and our, you know, focus on not just POWs until they were released, but also MIAs. They have over 300,000 MIAs to this day. 300,000 in addition to the millions killed. And so it's a relatively tiny country compared to ours. And that's where I think this notion of scale and the intimacy of triangulation becomes super important. Last night, we had a Marine, John Musgrave, in Kansas City, and somebody was asking him what he learned the most from the series, and he said, these guys in my dreams are still young and they're still trying to kill me. And I realized that their grandpas like me, and they're old, and I needed to know what they felt, and this film told me what they were thinking and what they were feeling. And there's surprising moments, as you know, in the film where a Viet Cong guy will look through the bushes and see Americans grieving over the dead or tending tenderly to the wounded. And he goes, it suddenly occurred to me that the Americans have the same kind of humanity that we Vietnamese have. And war is all about making the other nothing, beat bad, evil, you know, the head of the buffalo and the face of a horse.
Yeah. It's like what Musgrave, I think, was saying when about the whole business with calling people gooks and the whole business
Yes.
about being racist.
Yes.
And how he hated them and feared them, and how the war made you racist.
He said, I only killed one person in Vietnam, and that was the first person I killed. And I wondered how I was going to do this for 13 months. Marines went for 13, Army for a year. And then he said, and then a friend of mine stepped on a bouncing Betty mine, and it blew him up. And from then on, he made his pact with the devil, he said. And he would not hesitate to waste a gook or to zap a zinc or what. And he went through a series of disturbing things, because here's this incredibly thoughtful guy, and he says, it's racism 101. Make the subject out of an object, make an object out of a subject. And that's very necessary if you're going to have your kids fighting your wars for you and for them to stay sane. And later on, another Marine, not related in any way to Musgrave's action, Karl Marlantes, who you met in the very beginning of the film, he says that we're not the dominant species on the planet because we're nice.
Right.
And he said, and people always complain that the military turns young men into killers. I would suggest this is only finishing school. And it's very sobering to understand that. And you know, we've talked about this before, is that we always hide behind cliches. Thank you for your service. History repeats itself. It does not. We're condemned to repeat what we don't remember. Lovely phrase, poetic, not true, right? But Ecclesiastes, what has been will be again, what has been done will be done again. There's nothing nothing new under the sun, suggests that human nature remains the same, and it superimposes itself over the random chaos of events. And we can perceive those patterns, the themes, the motifs, the rhymes Mark Twain is supposed to have said. But what it really suggests is how powerful a tool history can be when we arm ourselves with the foreknowledge. Then we're prepared for these kind of ways in which human beings move into defensive positions and then into aggressive actions against each other intimately, but also obviously in a grand scale. For me, though, and I think there's a focus. We're drawn to war for the obvious reasons. It bleeds, it leads. It's human nature on steroids. But we focus on the conflict that's external only, and we do that to our detriment, I think, because we think it's about tribe against tribe, country against country, army against army. And it is that, and it's important to nail that down. But I found what's interesting with this film, and I'm not sure if you would agree, is that many of our characters undergo profound emotional and psychological transformations within themselves. They have wars, negotiations that may be wars within themselves. And that's as interesting to me as what happens in the battle. I'm not trying to distinguish one from the other, say one's more important, but I like following John Musgrave through the arc of his life. I like following Karl Marlantes, who is safely a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford and doesn't have to go, but hates the war, thinks it's one of the great crimes of the 20th century, but he's going to be damned if someone's going to go in place of him and perhaps lose the lives of his men or his own life, and he has to go, and is highly decorated. But, I mean, It isn't just as simple as the binary response to Vietnam that often happens over the, Thanksgiving dinner table with the awkward silences or the arguments at a bar over what happened. And that's where we're hoping we can pull some of the fuel rods out and permit a more civil discourse about it.
Yeah, I think that's really one of the powerful aspects is the biographical arc, the kind of emotional arc of many of the characters that you have in it, and how they're transformed, and how they are transforming you as the viewer when you're watching this. And even with one of the shorter ones that you had, Denton Crocker, for instance,
Yes.
you get this sense of a transformation with him that toward the end, he's doubting
Yes.
everything that he believed about the war.
This is, Gerald is referring to a storyline that preoccupies the third and fourth episode in which we meet Denton Crocker's mother and sister, who you saw twice there, Carol Crocker. She's going to go on after his death to this, and it's clearly, this is a Gold Star family. And it is stunning, the dynamics of what they were willing to share. And let's remember, a Gold Star mother does not have to share any of this with us, but there's a moment at the very first bite at the beginning of the third episode where he's a bookish kid, is interested in history, and she's reading to him from Henry V and the St. Crispin's Day speech about how those abed in England will feel themselves less manly for having not taken part in this. And there's something in this old woman's that flashes across her face in which she realizes, oh my God, I'm complicit. And nothing is said in the film. The film doesn't point arrows towards it, but you cannot imagine the mother's anguish. She's going to relive 2 episodes later what happens when the guy in uniform walks up the steps. But it is nothing like what's happening over her face as she prepares this guy to go to war, who then will have, as you say, all the expected doubts.
Yeah. One final question. I know race has been a major theme in many of your films. How's race working here? What are the issues of race with Vietnam, and what kind of a challenge was that for you to depict it in the film?
Well, as we've talked before, I don't think you can scratch the surface of American history, any activity, without touching on race. I'm doing a big history of country music right now. Mm-hmm. I'm more than halfway through the editing. It's really coming along. It's really nice, too, to work on something which people die of broken hearts, And it's very elemental emotions and very direct, and it's wonderful. But it's interesting that if you were to arbitrarily say who the pantheon of the early country music giants were, maybe A.P. Carter of the Carter family, maybe Jimmy Rogers, maybe Hank Williams, maybe Bill Monroe, who invents, like Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie, a whole new art form, bluegrass, out of old traditions. And very similar in time of when it occurs, abstract expressionist painting, bebop, and bluegrass. And that all has to do with speed and virtuosity and leaving the melody pretty quickly. All of them had an African American at the heart of their transformation of their music from good to the kind of pantheon that they're in. And so even in this relatively white culture of country music, there's an amazing tradition. So it's always there in everything that we do. And so it's present, obviously, in the one in Vietnam. And I don't think it was a struggle as much as we were going to open the door to all these things. What Vietnam does do is it increases the stakes of that, because the American dynamic, as we know from Ferguson, as we know from Charleston a couple of weeks ago, as we know from slavery, as we know from everything, is central to our narrative in a dynamic between white Americans and African Americans. And you can always bring in Native Americans to further and importantly complicate that. But here we have all of that here. We have Native Americans fighting, we have Hispanics fighting, African Americans fighting in disproportion. In fact, Native Americans fought disproportionately more than any other minority in Vietnam. Canadians, 30,000 Americans we estimate, defected to Canada. 30,000 Canadians volunteered for the United States military, which is just a wonderful, scale. No wall needed. Right? But of course, the larger thing is the Asian race question, and that becomes, as your earlier question alluded about John Musgrave and Gooks and Dinks and all of the epithets, important. They also called us Gakamai, which means American bandits, which is about as bad a thing you can say. And so that was their N-word to us. And so I think, you know, this moment just reminds me of just right after the Civil War, I spoke to a group of people in Wilmington, Delaware, and this 12-year-old girl stood up and said, white, and said, "What is racism?" You know, and you're kind of like at that moment. And I said, I thought that it was the horrible flip side of a very understandable human emotion, which was love of one's own. And the metastasis of that is what we struggle still today to deal with. And it manifests itself in so many different levels and colors within the Vietnam thing. But I think still, from my own interest in American history, that dynamic between America and its African American population. I mean, you just watched Charlottesville a few weeks ago, and you see this sort of unbelievably raw hatred for black people. But how did we begin this whole thing today, right? We saw a group of patriotic African Americans. We saw their leader. We saw a man sing our shared national anthem. And you could see in Vietnam that, particularly in the early years, the disproportionate participation of African Americans and disproportionate casualties and deaths fell to them, defending, as they have since the Boston massacre and Crispus Attucks, what we all believe in. And it's just, you know, I'm hoping at some point I'll be able to make something in which we've sort of escaped the specific gravity of that, but I don't think it's ever going to happen. You know.
I've been enjoying this immensely, Ken. I should tell the audience, Ken and I go back to baseball.
Baseball.
And
Gerald said the greatest thing in baseball, he said that when they study our civilization 2,000 years from now just think about what's happened in the last 2,000 years, right? Okay? When they study our American civilization 2,000 years from now, Americans will be known for only three things: the Constitution, baseball, and jazz music. He said they're the three most beautiful things Americans have invented. And I agree, completely. And I've spent most of my professional life trying to honor what he said.
Well, Ken and I, we go back a ways, and this has been very nice for me because the Florentine film people have usually it's been the other way around. You guys have been questioning me.
Right.
So now I get a chance to question you.
So Gerald has been in half the films we've made in the last 20 years.
But the Vietnam War is powerful film. And I certainly hope that one of the things I'm hoping is that my students will watch it and will draw from it and understand it in ways that will help them understand what it means to be an American.
We've been heartened as we've taken the film around, and even in the editing room, we had a moment when you saw the assassination, and that's as bad as it gets, ladies and gentlemen, is the assassination of Lam on the streets of the Saigon during the Tet Offensive. We had a kid, intern, who came down. He was clearly upset, and I always ask the interns to answer, you know, what they think first, because they know everything when you're 20 years old. I mean, now I know nothing. But I remember, and I don't say that in a denigrating fashion, I did know everything then, and I don't know anything now. And so I asked Frank, and he was very agitated. He said, you know, I've grown up with violent images in the comic books, on TV, in the movies, graphic novels, but particularly video games. And that guy's really dead. And he started to cry. And I said, yeah, he's really dead. And we've been heartened all the way along the line that perhaps even in the numbing that takes place in our media culture, that perhaps some of the, you know, we've tried to be very elemental about this and not impose, as I was saying, any political agenda on it, but not even impose ourselves and the desire of filmmakers to sensationalize things and just say, this is what it is, this is what happened, that it will permit people who, obviously our generation, that is still saying what happened, as Karl Marlantes spoke in the film, but also every other generation who's involved. We have to, this is the most important event in American history since the Second World War. We ought to know now how to talk about it.
Yes. Ladies and gentlemen, Ken Burns.
Thank you.